in a part of the Nile Valley that was soon going to be flooded by the construction of the Aswan Dam. The archaeologist Fred Wendorf made a groundbreaking discovery. In 1964, he found a prehistoric burial site which contained 61 skeletons near the border between Egypt and Sudan. This burial site, called Jebel Sahaba, was constructed by the members of the Qadan culture about 14,000 years ago. Because almost all the skeletons showed clear signs of physical trauma, Wendorf and his colleagues thought they had found the oldest battlefield in history. But were these skeletons really the victim of the first battle? And did organized warfare even exist at all at that time? If so, what did it look like? In this video, we address these questions and search for the origins of war. Recently, Isabelle Crevecoeur and her colleagues re-examined the Jebel Sahaba finds. They do not believe the skeletons are the victims of a battle. The dead women, children, and men all show signs of fresh and healed injuries. Also, they were not all buried at the same time. This suggests that Jebel Sahaba is not a trace of the first battle in history, but a burial place for the victims of ongoing small acts of violence, i.e., raids, ambushes, and the like. The injuries, which were to a large extent caused by arrows and spears, also support this idea. At least 2 skeletons show that people were struck down and then executed while lying down on the ground by an arrow through the lower jaw into the head. In some cases, the skeletons have numerous wounds. In tomb number 44, for example, lies a 30-year-old woman whose body contained 21 stone splinters from numerous arrowheads. Like many other skeletons, she had a broken forearm, an injury that typically occurs when defending oneself against an impact weapon, such as a club. However, the young woman's arm had healed by the time of her death, which suggests that she had been in a fight at least twice in her life. Jebel Sahaba is considered one of the earliest archaeological pieces of evidence of deliberate violence between groups. However, since it probably was a series of smaller clashes over a long period, the question remains whether these events can be considered war. To get to the bottom of this, we must ask what war is in the first place. The archaeologist Andrew K. Scherer defines war as, quote, a collective effort involving conflict among autonomous groups that involves not only physical trauma but also emotional and psychological trauma. Firstly, this means that war takes place between 2 separate groups. Secondly, a large proportion of these groups are involved in it in some way. And thirdly, physical and psychological injuries are caused in the process. Most archaeologists more or less agree with this definition. In the eyes of most military historians, however, it lacks a crucial aspect, namely that of organization. In their eyes, a fight is only to be understood as war if several combatants are organized under a leader and operate in a formation and/or follow a tactic. For the purposes of this video, we add this point to our definition of war. War is organized. Organization does not mean that there has to be a big battle. Ambushes, feuds, and small skirmishes can be considered war as well. In terms of size, the fight in the Nile Valley almost 14,000 years ago could potentially be seen as war. However, it is unclear to what extent the clashes were organized and who was involved. Given the age of these finds, a question arises that has been discussed by researchers and philosophers for centuries, namely if war has always existed and if it is simply part of human nature. Winston Churchill wrote in his treatise on World War I, quote, "The story of the human race is war. Except for brief and precarious interludes, there has never been peace in the world. And before history began, murderous strife was universal and unending." End quote. Churchill's view is in the tradition of the political philosopher Thomas Hobbes, who believed that war was in the nature of man, and imagined life in a primitive society to be, quote, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, end quote. Unlike Churchill, for a long time most archaeologists agreed with the views of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who, in response to Hobbes' grim scenario, created the notion of a noble savage, who lived peacefully, in harmony with nature. As a result of this, and in the light of the horrors of World War II, many scholars thought of prehistoric warfare as a minor matter. Consequently, they tried to present prehistory as a time of peace, and often ignored possible traces of war. Weapons and armor tended to be understood by researchers as status symbols or hunting weapons, and prehistoric fortifications were seen as ritual markers or purely practical devices. One example that still causes great debate today are the walls of Jericho. While some consider them a defensive structure, others, such as the famous Dutch primatologist Frans de Waal, think they were protection against the spring floods from the nearby mountains. This assumption that war was unimportant in prehistory was really only challenged when the influential archaeologist Lawrence H. Keeley published his book War Before Civilization: The Myth of the Peaceful Savage in 1996. In this book, he demonstrates that prehistoric warfare was serious business and neither primitive nor incidental. He emphasizes that conflicts in these periods, while small in comparison to modern conflicts such as the 30 Years' War or the World Wars, had enormous consequences for the hunter-gatherers of prehistory. Quote, "Primitive warfare is actually total war, waged with very limited means," end quote. The conflicts of prehistory were mostly short and small, but you have to put the whole thing in perspective. For the hunter-gatherer groups of the time, which usually consisted of around 20 to 30 members, even the loss of a handful of adults could mean a threat to their existence. Keeley's book led archaeologists and historians to reconsider the question of the origins of war. No conclusive answer has been found, and we will not find one here either. It is important, however, not to make the mistake of thinking that there was a peaceful world before history just because no traces of war have survived. Just as those who argue that prehistory was dark and warlike must prove that there was war, those who view it as a lost paradise must prove that there was a peaceful prehistory. That being said, let us search for the first traces of war. About 500,000 to 300,000 years ago, humans mastered the use of fire and developed weapons to hunt big game. Groups of hunters could now use spears to kill large animals such as deer, horses, or woolly mammoths. A famous example of these early weapons are the so-called Schöningen spears, which are between 290,000 and 337,000 years old. Afterwards, hunting methods and weapons became more and more sophisticated, points and blades made of horn and stone appeared, and group cooperation became more complex. By the last ice age, about 115,000 to about 11,700 BC, spears, clubs, and thrown stones were the most important weapons. Although there is no clear evidence that the hunter-gatherers of this period also used their weapons against members of the same species, it is very likely that they used all available means when fighting occurred. One of the earliest indications of the use of weapons in conflicts was found in the Shanidar cave in what is now Iraq. Shanidar III, a Neanderthal about 45,000 to 50,000 years old, has a wound in the chest area that was most likely caused by a throwing spear. Because it had long been assumed that the Neanderthals did not use throwing weapons at all, and because their physique definitely put them at a disadvantage when throwing spears, researchers assumed that it was a modern human, that is, a Homo sapiens, who had thrown the spear. Accordingly, the find was interpreted as a sign of conflict between Neanderthals and early humans. This, in turn, became an argument in the debate about how humans replaced Neanderthals. Indeed, there are two major theories about this: the interbreeding theory, which assumes that humans and Neanderthals interbred, and the replacement theory, which assumes that modern humans forcibly replaced Neanderthals and Denisova humans, possibly even wiping them out in some kind of genocide, which could be seen as early signs of war. These possibilities are still discussed today, even in more publicly read books like Yuval Noah Harari's bestseller, Sapiens. According to him, only a small part of the genes of modern humans originated from Neanderthals, which makes it unlikely that they had interbred on a large scale. Harari therefore suspects that humans prevailed in the competition for food thanks to better technology and better social skills, and thus gradually displaced Neanderthals. This suggests that there were conflicts between individual groups, but probably no organized warfare yet, and certainly no coordinated actions by humans against Neanderthals. the two aspects that gave humans an advantage, their use of technology and their social skills, were rapidly evolving. By the late Paleolithic, about 35,000 to 12,000 BC, weapons and hunting techniques were becoming more effective, and new weapons such as the atlatl, a spear-throwing lever, appeared on the scene. And soon, in the Neolithic, they were increasingly used against members of the same species. When Erhard Schoch, a wine grower from the small town of Thalheim in Baden-Württemberg, Germany, was working in his garden in 1983, he made a gruesome discovery. He came across a pile of human bones. It was not long until archaeologists began digging a pit in order to get to the bottom of the matter. They discovered the skeletons of 34 men, women, and children, a large number of whom had been killed by a blow to the head. The injury patterns indicate that they had been surprised, executed with a stone axe, and then buried in a pit. This method of execution was also used in two other well-known massacres at Kilianstedt and Schletz, and is linked to a whole series of lesser-known acts of violence that took place in Europe around 5000 BC. By means of so-called isotope analysis, a method that sheds light on what a human or animal ate, and therefore hints at a certain habitat, researchers were able to show that the people buried in the Thalheim death pit belonged to three groups. Strikingly, there were no female corpses among those who lived in Thalheim itself, which is why the archaeologists assumed that the massacre was related to an abduction of women. However, why the women of the other groups were executed, and why so many people of different groups were in one place at the same time, remains a mystery. It is also unclear whether these massacres indicate organized warfare between distinct groups. They, however, do indicate that the people of the linear pottery culture in Eastern and Central Europe, which produced many technical, economic, and social innovations, resorted to violence to secure their survival and their interests. The linear pottery culture is considered the oldest culture in Central Europe that had permanent settlements in the Neolithic. They are most famous for their longhouses. The shift from hunting and gathering to a sedentary lifestyle is part of a vital change in human history called the Neolithic Revolution. People began to settle down, cultivate crops, and raise livestock. This not only led to greater population density, but also intensified conflicts over resources. People built up stocks from the surpluses they produced, but that also meant that they had more to lose. Their supplies provided a worthwhile target for those who had not yet settled, and other raiders, which, according to the historian Kaushik Roy, led to increased fighting between groups. Along with territorial and personal disputes, the struggle for resources was the most common trigger of conflict throughout Eurasia. To protect themselves and their supplies and possessions, settled groups soon began to fortify their settlements. 4 warriors armed with a bow and arrow are attacking a group of 3 archers. This scene can be found on a cave painting from Morella la Vella in northeastern Spain, which has been drawn a good 5,000 years ago. It is probably the oldest known representation of a fight between archers. Because of the positioning of the figures, some historians assume that it is the first depiction of a double envelopment, with the 4 archers on the left attacking the 3 on the right. Of course, this is far from evident, and one should not read too much into such illustrations. But taken together with other cave paintings dating roughly to the same time, it can be taken as the first actual indication of cooperation and tactics, and thus the 4th condition of our definition of war, organized action. One of these depictions shows 5 archers marching in column behind a leader recognizable by his headdress, and another shows the execution of a person lying on the ground. According to the military historian Arthur Farrell, these scenes indicate that there was a leader and an orderly procedure, quote, which is synonymous with the invention of tactics, end quote. By this, Farrell primarily refers to the most basic components of tactics, namely a hierarchy, the column, and the line. Like most researchers, he assumes that tactics and strategy derived from hunting strategies, for example driven hunts in which organized groups drove large animals into swamps or over cliffs. These hunting techniques were then transferred to fighting against members of the same species. The bow was one of 4 weapons that became widespread in the Epi-Paleolithic, or the Middle Stone Age, and the Neolithic. The other 3 are the sling, the dagger, and the mace. Except for the mace, they were all used for hunting as well. The bow and arrow were the most important of these weapons. They drastically increased the range and efficiency of long-range weapons, completely changing the conditions of hunting and fighting. A well-thrown spear had an efficient range of no more than 25 meters. A spear thrower of up to 100 meters. But even a simple bow could shoot an arrow over 150 meters or more and was much simpler to handle. With it, one could attack an enemy or opponent without having to put oneself in immediate danger, carry many projectiles, and fight effectively in a group. While Stone Age warriors of Western Europe relied on bow and arrows, Near Eastern warriors preferred the sling. Archaeologists found large quantities of rounded stones and fired clay balls that were certainly intended as ammunition for this weapon. The sling was superior to the earliest bows in terms of range and penetrating power, but those who mastered it could be absolutely deadly on a distance of up to 180 meters, with a maximum range of about 400 meters. The sling was used in primitive communities all over the world and was especially popular in the Mediterranean even into antiquity, most famously on the Balearic Islands. The most important Neolithic close combat weapons were spears, but maces and axes and adzes with blades and heads made of stone were also used. However, they were not nearly as important as the bow and the sling. These new and efficient weapons underline the increasing importance of armed conflict in the Stone Age. Combined with the evidence of tactics and the archaeological finds, they show that all 4 points of our definition were ticked in the Neolithic. Neolithic people waged war, and all too soon, war took on increasingly terrifying forms. When in 2015, a team of researchers studied the genetic diversity of our Stone Age ancestors, they noticed something strange. According to their data, about 7 to 5,000 years ago, there was only 1 man per 17 women in Africa, Europe, and Asia. This became known as the Y chromosome bottleneck. Anthropologists and biologists were baffled. Had men almost been extinct? Soon, it became clear that it was not the number of men that had declined so drastically, but merely their genetic diversity, which means that a small, interrelated group of men was reproducing with the bulk of the women. Nevertheless, the discovery puzzled biologists and anthropologists. In 2018, researchers at Stanford University found a plausible explanation. They suspect that the diversity of Y chromosomes has decreased due to cultural and societal changes. That is, that the male gene pool has shrunk so much because patrilineal clans have repeatedly fought each other over generations. Because membership in these clans passed from father to son, and wars wiped out more and more of these male bloodlines, in the end, only the men of a few clans actually reproduced with the majority of all women. This hypothesis fits with a number of hints that a, quote, burst of organized warfare, end quote, occurred in the Neolithic, which Arthur Farrell considers to be as drastic as, quote, Alexander's conquest of Persia in the 4th century BC or the march of Islam in the 7th century AD, end quote. The most important indication of this development is that between 8000 and 4000 BC, people increasingly began to fortify their settlements to protect themselves, their supplies, and their infrastructure that was necessary for their new sedentary lifestyle. Fortifications are probably the most impressive and unambiguous trace of organized warfare in the new Stone Age. They clearly show the impact war had on humankind's way of life. One of the places that was fortified very early is Jericho. The settlement had a ditch, walls that were 3 meters thick and 4 meters high, as well as a massive 10-meter tower that was built around 8000 BC. These constructions probably enclosed the entire settlement with its approximately 2,000 to 3,000 inhabitants. However, it is disputed whether it really was primarily a defensive structure. Some archaeologists suggest that the wall served as a protection against seasonal floods. But even if that was the wall's main function, it was also an effective protection against attackers, because until heavy siege equipment and mines were invented, a simple wall gave the defenders a huge advantage. Similarly, the attackers of Çatalhöyük found nothing but smooth walls. This settlement, which at first glance looks like a densely packed group of houses, on closer inspection turns out to be well fortified. The site, which was built between 7500 and 6300 BC, was not protected by a freestanding wall, but by the fact that the houses of the outermost row were connected to each other, so that their walls formed a linked line of defense. These dwellings were accessible only by ladders from the roof, so that the outermost ring of houses even formed a kind of double wall. If attackers managed to break through the outer wall, they were trapped in one of the simply furnished housing spaces and exposed to the defenders on the roof. In similar settlements, for example in Hachilar Höyük and Yumuktepe, the same system was even combined with an outer wall. Over the next few centuries, fortifications became common and improved rapidly. Around 5000 BC in Mesopotamia, the settlement of Tel es Savan was protected by a wall with a foundation. And another 500 years later, Yangalach, a city on the Trans-Caspian Plateau, had a wall with round towers that were no longer inside the wall but outside it. This was a milestone for defensive installations, because in case of an attack, it was possible to shoot along the wall at an attacker's flank. In 1991, a mummified body was found in Tyrol. It soon became known as Ötzi, due to an article in a Viennese newspaper which named him after the Ötztal Alps, where his body was found. About 5,250 years ago, an arrow pierced his shoulder blade, and a violent blow, possibly from a fall, crushed his skull. The exact circumstances of his death are still debated today. While some initially claimed to have found blood on his equipment, the Institute for Mummy Studies at Jurek Research Center in Bozen did not detect any human blood on either the dagger or the arrows he was carrying. However, the arrow wound in his shoulder, the cuts on his hand and arm, and the scratch marks all over his body indicate that he was involved in a fight shortly before his death. Ötzi is possibly the best known victim of early warfare, and as such stands for the fact that organized warfare existed in the Neolithic period. It might not be possible to determine whether it is in human nature to wage war or whether it is a learned behavior. But from the Neolithic period onwards, it certainly has been a crucial part of the human existence and has been a decisive influence on the development of human culture. It was not long until humans resorted to even more effective weapons and more complicated tactics and built stronger defenses. Fortified cities would soon become city-states, and eventually the first great empires would emerge. Cities and empires escalated war to a new dimension in the Bronze Age, and henceforth, war, unlike any other force, would decisively shape humanity and the course of history. But this is a topic for a future video. Thank you for watching, and thanks to all our patrons. You make these videos possible, so thank you for keeping the channel alive.